in this episode.
Any rational thinking person creates this deep cognitive dissonance being told that there's a God that's all loving, all good, all powerful. And then what happens in the world, in reality. So, look, I traveled the world and for a period of my life did international human rights work. I posed as a customer in brothels in India where 10-year-old girls are forced to provide sex to customers 5 to 6 times a day. Little boys are chained to poles in child slave labor. I posed as an investor at this plant where they roll cigarettes, and if they don't meet their quota, they're beaten with electrical cords. So in some ways, my Christian theism collapsed in those experiences. Like, what do I tell these little girls? Like, well, look, God is actually all good and all powerful. But God works in mysterious ways. And God's given everybody a free will. And this momentary suffering, it'll be okay because in the afterlife there will be justice. Well, that doesn't help the little girl or the little boy. Like that theology actually, sort of removes the human responsibility and accountability for what happens in the world. So religious people say, well, I don't know how God can allow so much suffering in the world. Well, the question is, why do we? It has nothing to do with God. Why do we allow so much suffering in the world?
You are not a sinner. 20 things Jesus didn't say. Was Jesus Christian or an atheist? Are some of the provocative essays from Jim Palmer in Deconstructionology, his popular Substack blog, where Jim explores the intricate and unfortunately for most thorny relationship human beings have with religion and modern Christianity in particular. I came across Jim's work through his discussion with Kadel Lass on Philosophy Portal and was immediately drawn to his dialectical approach to religion through a deeply philosophical lens and found him, unlike old mate Jordan Peterson, to be genuinely wrestling with God and the existential givens of being human. Jim Palmer is a philosopher, radical theologian, spiritual director, and existential health counselor. He is a founder for the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality and has written multiple books such as Inner Anarchy, Dethroning God and Jesus to Save Ourselves, and the World and Divine Nobodies, Shedding Religion to Find God. I sincerely do hope this is the first of many conversations to come about Jim's project, as it was an utter delight for me, and I hope you'll find it as edifying as I did after this quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always going to be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode.
Yeah, I was saying that, so I don't identify as an atheist because I don't really identify with anything. I don't like labels particularly. And unfortunately, I guess, it's often the case that atheism sort of has some baggage associated with it. I think that at least among religious or quasi-religious people, and I think that's in part because, sort of the new atheism or, the four horsemen, so to speak, Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Sam Harris, early on were pretty hard on religious people, right? Like you had Dawkins talking about how sort of almost any person that subscribes to religion, it must be some sort of a mental disorder or something of this nature. And so course, Chris Hitchens died, and so did Dennett, and Dawkins and Harris is still here. But I find that both Dawkins and Harris are much more sympathetic these days. I don't know, maybe Dawkins is getting a soft place in his heart for the philosophy of religion, and Sam Harris is sort of really explores non-religious spirituality. And so I think that his kind of place in this atheist spirituality is, I think, quite meaningful for people. I think that in the atheist conversation, you often don't find a lot of room for the philosophy of religion. I mean, look, we can all argue about how traditional religion in its toxic form is, is very destructive. Like I don't think many rational people would argue that. But there is the philosophy of religion, which is looking at some of the archetypes and themes and stories and narratives and myths that come out of religion as sort of a universally relevant, repository of our trying to figure out the lived human experience deeply. And so, now, and I get people, and I get in trouble all the time because, of course, I will say things like, well, I could argue that Jesus himself was an atheist if you looked at it a certain way, and that you can't really pin the Christian religion on Jesus because it often doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with what you see about Jesus in the Gospels. Whether or not you take the historicity of Jesus to be true or you see it as a myth or legend, either way, I think that that in many ways Christianity is sort of a not necessarily in alignment with the Jesus you see in the Gospels, who spoke truth to power, did not subscribe to empire, tended to be a revolutionary at heart, somebody who deconstructed his own religious background and often found fault in it. I don't think Jesus would be a fan of Christian nationalism. I don't think Jesus, I don't think you can use Jesus as a poster child for the alt-right. And
I doubt it. Yeah.
So, and I find that there's all kinds of things that atheists and Jesus would certainly share in common once you sort of, untether the Christian religion from the person Jesus himself. And a lot of the work I do is working with people in religious deconstruction. And in fact, some of them will basically deconstruct and leave behind large chunks of their Christian theology. And yet many will kind of move forward with Jesus as a figure as meaningful in some way to their spirituality, despite the loss of the bulk of their Christian theology.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to explore there. I'd say this. So, firstly, as I was mentioning before we started recording, I base this analysis of mine of your work not on your books per se, but purely on your Substack writings, all the way from the shorter kind of write-ups to the longer blog posts. Like, for instance, the one I read just last week was the one, You're Not a Sinner. Great one. Great piece. I thought it was like well written. And then, so, let me backtrack a little bit to get a bit into philosophy. I'd say my relationship with religion is Kantian, in the sense that even though I'm an autistic nerd that enjoys the St. Anselm's argument and Aquinas' argument and all of these a priori ontological arguments, I pretty much take the view that, the great atheist philosopher Graham Oppy takes, that all of these ontological arguments are essentially just like useless. Like, just, I mean, it's okay, fun. It's fun to play, let's call it some kind of intellectual academic game. But when it comes to speaking of God, even at an intellectual level, they don't really count as much. But then that's more on the level of theology. But then now I come to, I would say, the work of obviously yourself. And I haven't really looked into this, but more like meta-modern Christianity and that kind of movement. Or then there's, of course, the postmodern Christian movement. And for me, and this is, I think, the person who's single-handedly influenced me the most is Peter Rollins' paratheology or radical theology. I mean, I've spoken to Peter a couple of times, and really, I remember when I came across his stuff maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was like, this guy is on to something, man. Like, so, I say all of that as a bit of like a prelude to discuss this point in this like kind of like very Wittgensteinian sense of like what religion is and what Christianity is in terms of like it's like a life form, a language game. It's a lived out experience in this world. It's not even a set of axiomatic beliefs. In a way, I've got to give old mate Jordan Peterson a bit of credit here. Like, he does make that point, and he says it. I think he kind of uses that idea in a bit of a manipulative way, but nonetheless, he is right that it's not like I believe in, proposition A, proposition B, and so on. And so for me right now, what matters is really what I would say, and this is a great term. I really like that you use this term, existential help, and then spiritual counseling or spiritual directory as like a spiritual director. Because for me, what matters is really, what does that project entail as it pertains to religion? And I don't want to talk about like people who are religious, not religious, whatever, but as it pertains to this, what we call religion, because as you, I think, would agree, Jim, the religious attitude isn't going away anywhere anytime soon. In fact, perhaps it's now, we're probably more religious now than ever in like a very, very interesting way. So I guess my question would be bipartite. Firstly, can you talk a bit about this, like, what you view the role of theology is outside of these like mental games of like, kind of like what the William Lane Craig types do? And secondly, onto that idea of religion as like an embodied, acted out experience in the world, in the Wittgensteinian sense. Can you talk a bit about like your work in the praxis of what you do as a spiritual director and an existential health counselor?
Well, I think to sort of come back to a point that you made about Peter Rollins is that, and of course you are aware, of course, of all this, that, there is a death of God theology, right? And you can take it all the way back, I guess, to Nietzsche. He's at least a significant figure in death of God theology, because after all, he is kind of made popular by the statement of one of his novels that God is dead, and that the work of Darwin postulating a theory of the universe that no longer necessitated a belief in God ultimately led to this idea that, well, okay, there isn't a need for God and God is dead. And there's always been, in the 60s, there were the radical theologians and the death of God theology grew. And I think even Zizek recently came out with a book about Christian atheism. So now so now there's a Christian atheism sort of idea here, which is, I think, is actually one of the, if I was going to sort of redo or reframe or repurpose Christianity in its most meaningful form, I really think that Christian atheism would be the way to do it if you once kind of properly understood that it's sort of like it's dismissing the idea of God as the big other and understanding God as as a sort of spiritual phenomenon that expresses itself in community and so on. And so that Altizer wrote the book, The New Gospel of Christian Atheism, and that's probably one of the best summations, of the idea. So, it is true that a lot of religion and philosophy, can be criticized as being very abstract, speculative, metaphysical, and maybe a little too metaphysically minded to be any earthly good. Some people might say, but of course we know that beliefs do matter, right? Like if a person goes into a school and blows himself up and killing many innocent children, at that point you realize what a person actually believes matters, what they believe about God matters, what they believe about life's greatest existential questions could deeply matter. I mean, they matter, beliefs matter. So, you know, um, I think that I talk about I talk a lot about existential health because I fundamentally believe that the cornerstone and the bedrock component of overall well-being and health is having a constructive relationship with the givens of human existence. And I take the givens of human existence to be human immortality, right? There's 100% mortality rate. The groundlessness of life, that we don't arrive in a universe with inherent absolutes, meaning and purpose, and this sort of thing. Another one in my mind would be human insatiability, that regardless of what we ever do, there will always be some sense of lack, and we will never be perfectly happy. And we have to accept this as part of the human condition. Lacan in his work in psychoanalysis talks extensively about this idea of lack. And I think that one of the reasons why religion, that narrative of religion, is often very compelling is that it kind of answers all these in a way, right? Like if you believe in God, there's an afterlife, and so there's eternal life. So human immortality is in play. The idea that you have a God-shaped hole somehow and God can fill that raises the idea that you can actually find this perfect peace and happiness. And if you fail, the good news is that after you die, you will be in heaven where there is perfect peace and happiness, no suffering. God is the master signifier for almost all existential certainty, purpose in life, meaning in life, your identity, where the universe came from. And so I think this is why when Nietzsche said God is dead, and when this kind of exodus out of organized religion can sort of leave this nihilistic possibility for people, it's more than just a feeling of meaningless. It's when the structures or the scaffolding of, the epistic scaffolding collapses for people, and they can no longer make sense of the world. And this can, be highly problematic. So I talk of existential health is that we have to cultivate a constructive relationship with these givens. And we don't generally do that because the human person's main way of coping is denial. So, like Erwin Yalom's work around death, and, that if you walk up to most people on the street and you ask them, well, hey, are is the anxiety of death something that keeps you up at night? Most people probably say no, but it's because it's kind of anchored in the unconscious, or the subconscious, driving almost everything that we do. We're not, although we're not, aware of it. So the thing with spiritual counseling, so to speak, or spiritual directors, is that historically there's been this unfortunate division in I don't want to necessarily call it the mental health field, but it involves two things. One is when it comes to God and spirituality, it's the priest, it's the pastor, it's the guru, it's the mystic. When it comes to therapy, it's the therapist, it's the psychoanalyst, and unfortunately, the two have often been very divided in the sense that, therapeutic culture has not historically been fond of wanting to address issues related to God and spirituality, because after all, that's a thing that you do with your priest, your pastor, your guru. It's not really something that comes up, or at least in the past, in therapeutic culture. And so now people like Erwin Yalom came and, in 1980, he wrote a book called Existential Psychotherapy, and he kind of made the case that we really need to start thinking about existential matters as the core of healthy human personhood. And then came along the distinction of religious trauma syndrome, which has not yet been included in the DSM. It probably will be the next time around, but at least it sort of began to anchor religion in the mental health field and therapeutic culture, particularly as it's a traumatic, it mirrors trauma as an experience if you've been in a very high control religious environment. But so one of the questions is, where is it that a person could go and meet with someone where they know there's going to be no judgment, there's not going to be preferencing a belief system or a philosophical way of thinking that you're trying to steer the person toward, but is a safe place where a person can kind of be with what's there for them in their own spiritual life, their own inner life, and to cultivate a spirituality that's meaningful and liberating for them based on their autonomy, based on personal agency, not under coercion, not needing to conform to a traditional religious framework. And so the spiritual direction historically has been a religious thing. I mean, you go all the way back in the Christian tradition to like the Desert Fathers, and certainly in Catholicism and contemplative Christian spirituality, the spiritual director would be with someone and sort of support them in strengthening their relationship with God. But of course, in the non-religious framework, or in atheist spiritual direction, for example, there is not that orientation towards either religion or a belief in God. But spirituality is universally meaningful. You don't need religion to be spiritual. It does, and so to have the opportunity to cultivate, that part of your life, that aspect of who you are, your existential health, and what we kind of use the word spiritual to refer to. In the UK, it's more common for this discussion to be around the term philosophical health instead of existential health. But that's not a perfect term either, because, people will, for better or worse, maybe in the Western mind, philosophy still might conjure up this idea of sort of a professional, academic sort of endeavor, which is unfortunate since philosophy actually means the love of wisdom. And we all know that it's, philosophy is a tool to that a person can construct their own way, their own view of life, their own worldview, their own values, and so on. So so that's what the spiritual kind of director role is. I'll shut up here shortly, but the term spiritual direction is a bad term because the word direction is a little is not quite right, because usually spiritual direction is not directive. So a guy named Carl Rogers, who pioneered person-centered therapy, he sort of discovered that the real sort of magic and beauty of the therapeutic culture is not the expertise of the therapist. It's the therapist's skill at cultivating a certain kind of environment in the therapy session. So Rogers argued that everybody has an inbuilt tendency towards wholeness and well-being, and that the therapist will do this if they will offer positive regard, empathy, acceptance, and vulnerability, that supplies or is the soil or the environment from which the client can cultivate wholeness and well-being for themselves. And I think spiritual direction kind of operates on that model, is that it's a companioning role that's working to strengthen the client's own autonomous spiritual path, to develop the skills and tools to be able to do that for themselves. Now, I don't mean in all that to say that there's not a need for all kinds of aspects of therapeutic work around all sorts of mental health disorders and so on, but I think that's kind of the approach taken in spiritual counseling or spiritual direction.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, in fact, when I read your work, I was thinking, yeah, it sounds, it feels a lot like more of this humanistic point of view in what you do. And then you mentioned Carl Rogers, and in fact, when I was reading some of your work, it even reminded me of Paul Tillich's great book, The Courage to Be. And yeah, he's an existentialist Christian, but also there's certainly a humanistic bent to his kind of way of, portraying Christianity. Uh, and like, there was a lot there. I think I want to just touch on this idea of kind of, yeah, all of the other dimensions of what you would call spiritual health or mental health or whatever, these terms are. Before we get into this like Substack notes, 10 problems I have with traditional Christian theism. I thought that really captures your thought well. And the reason I want to touch on before we get there, this idea of the other areas of kind of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis or psychology is like, I'm not sure in which interview you mentioned this, but it was probably in your talk on Philosophy Portal with Cadell last and the other gentleman. You said something. I mean, I don't think. Okay, maybe I'm gonna butcher this argument or like butcher this and like put it in a bit of a condescending way. But you said something sort of like this, right? You said a lot of people either within Christianity. Now this is gonna sound a bit condescending for any of the Christians, so just bear with me here. A lot of people within Christianity or like in church communities, they tend to be really, for lack of a better term, close-minded into their own bubble. And I mean it this way: we are all in our own bubbles, of course we are. But it's like if you talk of like theology or philosophy or mental health or any of these topics, it always is like if it's philosophy, it'll be within kind of Christian apologetics, that kind of theology. If it's about like mental health or kind of existential questions, it'll be pertaining to some kind of Christian counseling or like the Christian. It always is within the circle of, as you were saying, like the direction is towards God or towards some kind of big other or some kind of view of Christianity that they have. And at the same time, like a lot of the church book studies would be like a Bible study, or it would be about C.S. Lewis or something, or Augustine. So it's all within the Christian world. It's like, and you said something, you were like, it seems as if, because it's kind of like there's like a comfort where, yeah, you can play all of these intellectual games and like look into all these places, but at the end of the day, all roads lead to God. All roads lead to my version of what I think Christianity is. And I don't think that way of thinking or that way of, this sounds like a cliche, but spiritual work or whatever you may call it, does a loved one to face these, what you call beautifully, the givens of being human, the groundlessness, the kind of what Pascal talks about in Ponce, the despair, the ontological despair of human existence. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more into that, because talk a bit more on that point, because it's like there certainly are some, like, I can name some great Christian philosophers and thinkers who are well acquainted with philosophy, history, theology, the contemporary work in psychology. But at the same time, most of the time when I talk to Christians, and my best friend is a Christian, like I love the Christian community, they're wonderful people, is that it's like they're just in their own world. It's really hard to bring any of these other kind of Weltanschauungs or points of view. And I've even tried, and I think I mentioned this to Peter once, I've even tried to introduce some of Peter Rollins's kind of thinking in paratheology, and they're very antagonistic towards it, because unlike this kind of Richard Dawkins stuff, Peter is saying, hey, what I'm talking about is in the Bible itself. So it's an imminent kind of critique, right? It's something even somewhat traumatic in a positive sense there. But anyway, I'm talking a lot here, but I guess what I'm interested is, try like for you to flesh out this idea that, to put it in a very pithy statements, Christians should move beyond Christianity and then come back to Christianity, for lack of a better term.
Yes, I think that ideology is very difficult to crack. in almost every, religious ideology, political ideology, like,
Oh yeah.
and I think that what makes it especially difficult in religion is what's at stake with that ideology. You know, I mean, it's also true in other ideologies, but a person could switch their political party, and that probably would be quite a shift, but even more so with a person's religious ideology. And I think so much more is at stake because obviously, virtually every matter of existential significance is attached to a person's religious ideology. Not only that, but their existential certainty, their personal identity, the foundation of their morality, their family roles, and so on is connected to religion. And unfortunately, you mix in the idea that not everybody can be right, and that religion is often playing the game of who's right and who's not. And if you have your ironclad ideology and it's based on virtually everything of existential significance, being willing to entertain other ideas that fall outside the realm of that ideology would be viewed as a threat. And so, I mean, we could talk talk about you. And I wrote a article about, can you be a Christian and Buddhist, or, like, how does that work? And but the traditional Christian would not accept that because, you can't reconcile that, even what we were talking about earlier, the idea of non-duality with the conception of theism as God as a big other. And there are just all sorts of ways that Christian theology, and that whole ideology is just keeps people in that closed-minded state. Now, are there progressive Christians that are more willing to sort of get outside that? Yes. Is there an interfaith movement where people of different faiths are willing to kind of dialogue? Uh, um, yes, that kind of thing happens. The unfortunate thing partly is that, there's roughly 45,000 different Christian denominations around the world who don't agree on the same theology. And I think it's very misleading to sort of portray Christianity as having some kind of solid orthodoxy from the beginning that everybody agreed to. And there's always been disagreement on not just little issues, but core issues like the divinity of Jesus, the Trinity, reincarnation versus, the narrative of heaven and so on. And so there's there hasn't really been a solid core historically, including how one should even take the Bible versus, like there's a very huge assumption that more conservative religious people take about the Bible, which is that it was even meant to be taken literally. So, like, for example, the Adam and Eve story, creation, the fall, so on and so forth. Like, and of course, there are many people who do, in fact, believe that the Bible should be understood not literally, but based, on myth. And so that's a divide, but you can imagine, like if a person really concludes that there is a God who's in control and that God expects you to believe these things, that you're not going to be up for collaborating with other people on different views that would contradict that. And unfortunately, one of the ways that toxic religion, engenders its devotion is the use of fear. And probably fear and shame are two of the most powerful motivations. And if you can, who wants to jeopardize, being sent to eternal conscious torment in hell by by dabbling in some other open-minded beliefs that somehow contradict the Christian message? And so, it's very difficult. Hence why, you know, like uh, like Christian atheism is obviously an attempt to kind of a post disciplinary or post theological way of doing this. But the thing is like Cadell is going to be open to this as an atheist, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of Christians lining up to subscribe, to Christian atheism. So I think that it's possible, I believe it's possible for a person to find a religious or spiritual path that's meaningful to them without writing off all the others, or without closing themselves off, like you said, often exploring other frameworks of religion and spirituality can even enhance your own. And one of the ways that I think we especially suffer from our inability to do this is that, a lot of, there's already a preferencing for the global north, right? Like we preference Western civilization. It's a very Western, Eurocentric, even how we think we know things and knowledge just in general is driven by a Western Eurocentric tradition. Meanwhile, there's something called the Global South, and, indigenous spirituality, indigenous cosmologies. There are a lot of people in the Global South who aren't like having an existential crisis and like, in a fetal position, struggling with nihilism, not sure like what they're going to do in life because they don't know the meaning of life. And the reason is that their spirituality, so to speak, their meaning is anchored in relationships, the land, things that are solid and grounded. And the idea of needing a sort of speculative answer to a question about the meaning of life or the purpose of life or the existence of God as a big other and things like this, I don't think are quite, as significant. I mean, I did just recently publish an article calling into question this whole idea that we have a meaning crisis. It's a very privileged crisis to have because most of the world is waking up on the bottom of Maslow's triangle, and their crisis is, how can I get through today and survive crisis? And it is unfortunate. And, on top of that, we know that, you can commodify the topic of meaning. Well, hell, you can commodify the topic of the loss of meaning. And I think that, for $14.99, you can meet with the meaning crisis guru who will, give you the program on how to overcome nihilism and a lack of meaning. I'm not saying that we're not having to, the meta crisis is another. Like sometimes I feel like I hate to break it to you, but okay, the Great Depression was a meta crisis. Like all a meta crisis or a poly crisis. Every crisis is a meta crisis. Every crisis is a nexus of interconnected factors that manifest in some form, but that are really anchored in these different layers of problems. I mean, my daughter is a licensed social worker. Every case is a meta crisis. Every case of hers, because it's a residential crisis, it's a mental health crisis, it's a family crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a food crisis. Like it's the convergence, it's an interlocked, interconnected set of crises. So does ours look different? Yeah, the Great Depression was not just an economic crisis. It was a psychological crisis. I mean, there's a long list of things that are going on there. So I think the narrative is we're having a meta crisis, which we are, And what's driving it, or what the most troubling symptom of it, or the is the meaning crisis, which, you know, I think religion sets people up for a meaning crisis. But okay, like, there are these people called the existential philosophers. I mean, people like Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre, and other people, like, we've already gone through those. Like, we don't have to find a meaning to life because we are the meaning makers. Okay, so I think part of the problem is that we are not educated into existential health. And
well put. Yeah, I mean, okay, again, I'm going to provoke here. If I was some kind of Stalinist, I had like, dictator, what I would do is I would have a re-education camp on existentialism for every student, even adult, everyone. Go and read like Sartre, go and read Being in Nothingness. Like, this is your 6 month, that's your project. I'm glad you kind of mentioned this. We've had this, first of all, okay, there was a lot there that I want to comment on. That was brilliant. First of all, I never bought into this meaning crisis ideology ever. I think, in fact, crisis or crises is a brute datum, a brute fact of human existence. Being human itself is a crisis for me. And look, John Vervaeke, great guy. I've really enjoyed his stuff. Yeah, smart guy. I've really enjoyed his stuff in 4E Cognitive Science. Learned a lot from him, especially this notion of relevance realizations, which is super useful for even my work in AI. But saying that, though, the meaning crisis, first of all, it's not a scientific idea. You can't falsify it. It's not a scientific theory. Nor is it something I would say, well, it's kind of a contradiction. It is idiosyncratic to our time, but the structure of the crisis is, as I would say, is just a part of being human. And as you rightly point out, the Great Depression was a crisis, a meta crisis. And then that really good example you use, and here's where I think I really appreciate more I want to know more, practical, what are you doing? Like, forget about speculating theology and metaphysics, like your daughter. Like, that's, for me, in a way, what if you want to embody being a Christian, go and work as a counselor, go and work as a social worker, like, forget about trying to St. Anselm's ontological arguments. No one cares. Like, there are these really material ways you can act out your faith, the embodied ways, and that's, for me, where the crux of the matter is. And the other thing I would say is this, right? So, which is why before, when I kind of, asked you that question about, like, yeah, I find, like, a lot of these questions Christians kind of debate, and as you say, us privileged Westerners debate ad nauseum. There are some, in the history of thought, in the history from literature to philosophy to even theology, there are some pretty good writings. People really have thought about this stuff, and there are, I don't want to put like answers in like a very cliche way, but there are, these are questions that have been touched on by many brilliant thinkers in history. So it's like, in a way, one could say there's nothing new under the sun. But the way I would put it is that, yes, there is nothing new under the sun, but in the old, there's always something new that comes out of the old. Because this is like the Hegelian idea, everything is incomplete, whatever. But I think it's so, which is why, I do really like thinkers like, here I would say Paul Tillich, or even like, Jean-Luc Marion, who are well, who are well informed in the history of, they are philosophers in the history of philosophy, and they do understand that before we get into any of this Christian stuff, there are these other, other givens of being human that have to be thought about and discussed. But again, it's a fine balance between kind of the theological work and then what I think you would talk about, like spiritual counseling, existential health counseling, which for me at the end of the day is a lot more important than any of this like speculative theological work, which you can do as like a fun mind game, but that's not where it is, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that one of the effects of religion and perhaps even philosophy, or some aspects of philosophy, is who gets to decide the questions that we're supposed to be concerned about. Is there a God? What's the meaning of life? What happens when you die? And so on. Like, who decided that those are the essential questions to be answered? Because if you think about it, there aren't any conclusive answers anyway. At the end of the day, they're all speculative. That's why everyone has, there's an endless different way of thinking about this in theology and philosophy and so on. But one of the things I talk about with people in religious deconstruction is it's not finding better answers to the same questions. Maybe it's coming up with different or better questions. And so, for example, if you study anthropology, it seems to me that the modern human, roll the clock back 300,000 years ago in terms of modern Homo sapien. Imagine the first time that somebody in your tribe dies and you don't know what that means, or you've had, some kind of natural catastrophic event. You don't know what caused that, and you're trying to do your best to survive. So in that context, I believe the religious imagination was born. In other words, like there needed to be a way to make sense of the world, to create enough of the psychological immunity and stamina to keep the project of human survival going forward. And then the next thing is that the brilliant thing was to ritualize this to stabilize that view among the people. And then, of course, ultimately, the social technology of language was created, and we found language as a way of achieving this. Although I'd have to say that it was Derrida's work on the deconstruction of language, which was really the main deconstructional linchpin for my own deconstruction out of religion, when I realized that a word doesn't correspond with an objective thing in the universe, and there's more going on with language. The only thing that maybe people have more faith in than God is language. But I think that one of the things I always appreciated about anarchy as a political movement, I don't mean like I did a deep dive on anarchy as a political movement. Of course, people think of anarchy as a bunch of violence and lawlessness and things like this. But at its core, like the philosophy of anarchy as a political movement include things like mutual aid. Hell, how about that for an idea? Like we're going to create a life together where we honor mutual aid, and I think that we say there's a meaning crisis because we can't figure out why we're here, what the purpose of life is. But I still think that the Homo sapien proclivity to survive, if it's tended to properly, has an effect in who we are being with each other as human beings in the world. And I think that unfortunately religion becomes this tribal phenomenon that's attached to all these speculative answers on existential questions. And it's not really empowering people to, to do something constructive at the point of contact that they have with other people in the world. In fact, one of the roles of technology in all of this, is that there's a way that we are losing contact with an aspect of the lived human experience by, doing so much of it through the mediation of technology and on a screen and things like this. Like I'm in Costa Rica and I'm sitting right now at my desk, and the road that goes right by our house is right here. I literally can see people as they walk by, and they'll see me sitting here working and we'll wave. Buenos dias, ¿cómo está? People I see every day, and I know like there's a connectivity that happens. And, like I know we're beyond scapegoating the Industrial Revolution and, trying to figure out a way to connect people together more in community and all that. But I'm just saying that you've pointed this out a few times in this conversation, that it's not that difficult. Well, it is difficult, but I mean, we've proven that we can come up with these brilliant theological and philosophical ideas and theological philosophy and philosophical, and these marvelous, unbelievable, mind-blowing explanations for things. And who was, I can't remember, this said that we know everything except we know not how to live. And so apparently we need courses on just how to be human beings, how to have relationships, how to be in constructive community with one another. I really appreciate the more than human world conversation, because it really expands this out of the anthrocentric aspect of our place in the universe. And so what does it mean to be with myself, to be with my neighbor, to be with my community, to be with society, to be with the planet, ways of being with all of that are reducing suffering and promoting flourishing?
That is a question. I'll just add on to that, and I think this is important too. I've got to say this as like an Hegelian here. It's this. Todd McGovern has made this point that also, on top of everything you said, it's also the ability, and I think there's a very sublime part of the human existence. It's learning how to be lonely in public, and I think the phenomenology here is in a cafe. It's a beautiful experience where you go there, you go with your computer, whatever, book, to do get your work done, and you're there by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But you're still, there's a kind of a loneliness where you feel a bit detached from the other, but then there are other people around you too. So yeah, sometimes it's not a planned social event. Sometimes you might have a chat with someone. It might be nice, or the kind of the way you mentioned in like Costa Rica, people walking past, you wave at them. There is a sense where you are detached. It's not like a Sunday church service. I've got to shake hands and all that. It's just I'm there. I'm lonely, and for me that's I love being lonely in public. It's a beautiful experience. And in fact, during COVID and all of this, people couldn't do that. They just simply couldn't be lonely in public, and that's much needed. Wonderful. I think I certainly agree with you with your kind of critique of this idea that in a way it's not that complicated, bro, to get over your meaning crisis. Like you don't need stoic course or whatever. It's not that complicated.
Well, I was trying to find there's a quote by Simone de Beauvoir that I think is just absolutely brilliant. And of course, she wrote The Ethics of Ambiguity. Wonderful book. We all know that perhaps, she didn't quite get full credit for all her philosophical.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Being, kind of being in the shadows of Sartre. Most people know her by the second sex and second wave feminism. But here's the quote. She says, "It is in the knowledge of the genuine condition of our lives that we must draw our strength to live and our reasons for living." And I've always loved that quote because, no spiritual bypassing, no sort of metaphysical, existential speculations. It is in the knowledge of the genuine condition of our lives, as human people having lived human experiences, Homo sapiens in the universe, it is in the knowledge of the genuine conditions of our lives that we must draw our strength to live and our reasons for living. And I think people have a difficult time. They don't have the muscle to find in the genuine conditions of their lives, their reasons for living. Religion often talks about having faith in God, and maybe we need faith in life. What I mean by that is that there does appear to be, it's hard to talk about this without, sounding a bit, pseudoscience or, spiritualizing science. It's hard to have the right language, but it does seem fairly clear that you can find at virtually every level of existence, from the smallest particle to the most complex expression of human existence, there does seem to be a learning algorithm that has been active, and it is active at every level, and at every scale, that, Darwin talked about it as, natural selection. But there appears to be a learning algorithm, that an inbuilt component of life itself that tends toward complexity, growth, adaptability, and Homo sapiens. They say that 99% of all species are extinct. All species that have ever existed, 99% of them are extinct. Okay. So, but the Homo sapien, the human person, has survived. And I wonder if it's because a Homo sapien they evolved with a set of tools that allows them to cooperate with the learning algorithm in a way that privileged its, or not privileged, but it bolstered its survival as a species in the universe, because it learned a way to harness that learning algorithm to propel the species forward. And I guess that's just a long way of saying that maybe faith in life, or participation, a willingness to participate in the evolution of life itself, has, meaning and purpose and value, and maybe we're just at the starting point. Maybe, maybe, I realize that there are those that say that we're instead headed towards, like, what is the big freeze or heat death. And really the universe is not, it's, it's finite, and, there's going to be an end. But, like, there are others who don't hold that view, that the universe is actually expanding, and that it may not be headed for, the big freeze or whatever. There are some differences of opinion about it, but, like, who was ever taught that? What child ever learns any of this? Like, to respect life, to understand it, to figure out how to cooperate with it? Or, why don't we teach children what Simone de Beauvoir said about finding meaning in life? Why don't we introduce Western people to the global South and indigenous cosmologies, where you make meaning and compost daily life and relationships in a way that, bring you meaning, like that you can find meaning in love and relationship and even work, that it doesn't have to somehow be interjected into, like, your Starbucks coffee or your Subaru car. That every moment of human existence, like, it has to have something to say about your existential place in the universe.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. I'll just add on to this. Look, Schrodinger in his text, "What is Life?" He fundamentally posed this question that it seems that there's the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, but then for some reason, life negates or kind of goes against this second law of thermodynamics. We counter it. Homeostasis. We maintain something. There's like
Right.
this internal system. So obviously, there's been great work by people like Carl Friston in the sciences who've done. There's a free energy principle and there's active inference, and there are other schemas which are wonderful. I mean, I'm hoping to study this in the future in a PhD. But what I'm trying to say here is that there's something, whatever these scientific schemas, theories are, there is something really peculiar about life. And I'm not even talking about human life here, I'm just talking about life. But then we bring in the psychoanalytic angle where we speak of subjectivity. And this is in the Kantian sense. The subject is also a whole lot more different. The subject isn't just about, opposing thermodynamics or trying to be homeostatic subjects and survive, but they have this death drive where they start enjoying failure. So there are all these other theories that he can bring into really human life. And I guess I'm being a bit anthropocentric here because I'm talking about the human being, but then also when we say subject, it's something a lot more abstract than just like this humanistic notion, oh, I'm a human that affirm myself. So, and I guess my overall point, kind of adding on to what you were saying, is that there are these I would probably call them traditions. Say traditions that you can tap into, and people can sort of partake in. And then all of these other, for me, really are like secondary questions about like, meaning crisis, meaninglessness, whatever. You stop thinking about these things. Like, frankly, I mean, I'm an atheist, but I don't think I ever felt like nihilistic or anything ever. I mean, of course, we all go through moments of despair. But then I would say, thanks to kind of the tradition of philosophy that I was kind of enculturated in, it's given me a sense of, you could probably call it resilience or fortification against these like more ephemeral kind of moments we face. Okay, Amazon layoffs, AI layoffs, economic crisis, whatever. These things seem rather, even though, again, I want to be very clear here, I am a Marxist, so I think material circumstances do matter. I'm not saying it's just all abstract ideas, but I think the important thing here is like understanding that there's a lot more history to the human than what capitalism tells us in its immediacy. Like the human being has a history, and I think the moment we understand that the human being is a historical being, it makes one's life both rather dizzy, but at the same time it makes life, it kind of gives you this, as you were talking about in the Simone de Beauvoir sense, this affirmation of life too, if you view life that way. Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is a great segue, Jem, if unless you want to comment on what I said, but I would kind of want to touch on this Substack note, because I think that really does capture a lot of your thoughts. So look, there are 10 points here, and I don't know if we can get through all 10 in about half an hour. However, I'll just put an overlay right now when I'm editing for the viewer. But basically, I'll probably read out the first four, because the first four, I think they kind of come together in one category. So you say here, here are 10 problems I have with with traditional Christian theism. Christian theism conceives of God as a supernatural supreme being, separate from the universe and humankind. And the second one is Christian theism operates on the false narrative that God and humankind are estranged, and that this is a catastrophic problem to be fixed. You even touched on this in your Sinners essay too. Christian theism casts God with maleness, which lays the foundation for the dominance of patriarchy. And then you say, Christian theism creates an inescapable cognitive dissonance of a God who is all good, all powerful, and oversees, intimately involved, that intervenes in human affairs, but then doesn't. So you end with a paradox there, which is really important, I think, for me, for Christianity. But yeah, can you probably kind of touch on those 4 points for starters?
Yeah, I think that if you asked a Christian something like, do you believe that God is some kind of Gandalf being sitting on a throne in the sky? My guess is that most would say, of course not. I don't think that, and yet Christian theism conceives of ultimate reality as a supreme human like being that, and in my view, it's the least defensible view of God. That I don't even think that the Bible itself,
I concur. Yeah.
Teaches. So I think that you know, speaking of Darwin, he postulated a credible way of thinking about the existence of the universe that didn't require a separate God creating it. And I think that theism's biggest mistake is conceiving of God as the big other, and virtually every other aspect of Christian theology that I think is detrimental starts with that basic premise. As soon as you make God a person, you have to start assigning God certain characteristics like gender. And in this case, God in traditional monotheism is male. And then, of course, that sets the stage, like I mentioned, for, patriarchal religion. Um, in addition to that, this separation from God is taken a step further into an estrangement. And that idea is the cornerstone of the evangelical gospel in requiring the blood sacrifice of Jesus as a solution to the problem of sin, which created this estrangement from God. Now, the problem with all that is that all the theology wrapped around that is really indefensible. Like the idea of the original sin condition, like we'd have to believe that there was a literal Adam and Eve, and they literally had a scenario where they did something in defiance of God, and this created a condition that they genetically passed to the human race through childbirth. And the result of this genetic condition, which is called sin, is ultimately result in a person being condemned to eternal conscious torment unless they apply the solution, which is the blood sacrifice of Jesus on the cross and the atonement and so on.
Yeah, this is to put it in a pithy way, is point 5. Christian theism requires the death and blood sacrifice of Jesus to be the atonement of humankind's sins to satisfy God's holiness.
Right, and and once you make God the supreme being, the big other, then it starts to break down even further because, like I said, or like you mentioned, in Christianity, the idea is that God is all powerful, God is all knowing, God is all good, and God is all loving. But you can't be all those things at once because we know from our experience in the universe that all of them can't be true at the same time. Like, for example, if I was all good and all loving and all powerful, and I saw my daughter walking out on the street here and somebody ran up to her to assault her, and I did nothing at all to intervene, then I might be arrested and taken to jail because of my refusal to, issue aid in a situation where it was possible. So the idea that so we have all this horrific human suffering going on, and God is all powerful, yet God chooses not to do anything, is a very difficult thing to explain. Now, religion tries to explain it. Oh, well, everyone has to have a free will. God's not going to force anybody to love him. If people use their free will to do all these terrible things, well, that's, God loves us enough to give us a free will. Well, still, let's take it back. to what I just said. If I see my daughter walking down the street, a man walks up to assault her, I do nothing, and the person questions me about it, and I said something like, well, the abuser has a free will. It wouldn't have been right for me to go out there and intervene and save my daughter from this rapist, because after all, we should create space for this, person's free will to do this sort of thing. Maybe, he'll learn a lesson. It will be better. Maybe my daughter will learn something through all her pain and be a better human being. So let's just kind of wait and see what happens here. Like any rational thinking person creates this deep cognitive dissonance, being told that there's a God that's all loving, all good, all powerful. And then what happens in the world, in reality. So look, I traveled the world and for a period of my life did international human rights work. I posed as a customer in brothels in India where 10-year-old girls are forced to provide sex to customers 5 to 6 times a day. Little boys are chained to poles in child slave labor. I posed as an investor at this plant where they roll cigarettes, and if they don't meet their quota, they're beaten with electrical cords. So in some ways, my Christian theism collapsed in those experiences. Like, what do I tell these little girls? Like, well, look, God is actually all good and all powerful, but God works in mysterious ways. And God's given everybody a free will. And this momentary suffering, it'll be okay because in the afterlife there will be justice. Well, that doesn't help the little girl or the little boy. Like that theology actually, sort of removes the human responsibility and accountability for what happens in the world. So religious people say, well, I don't know how God can allow so much suffering in the world. Well, the question is, why do we? It has nothing to do with God. Why do we allow so much suffering in the world? There's not a God in the sky pulling strings that is all powerful and all loving and all good. We have plenty of evidence that this is true, and no clever theological explanation is ever, going to change that basic fact. So I think that those first 4 or even 5 points, Chris Hitchens said that religion poisons everything. And I think you have to be a more nuanced. Like, what are we talking about when it comes to religion? Not one person's experience of religion can be indicative of everybody's. And we could have a discussion about how religion has often been a inspiration for compassion and empathy and service and humanitarianism and so on. But, I think that as long as religion promotes this view of God, I think that it does harm, in an endless number of ways. And so in that sense, I think that religion often does more harm than good because it perpetuates an idea of God, and then all the other pieces of it, disempowering pieces, like you're dependent on the big other because you're not powerful enough, you're not smart enough or wise enough. It's like beyond what you can do. We need divine intervention. We need an answer from God, rather than taking responsibility ourselves for the condition of the world. And so,
Well, I didn't know about that, what you just said about like India, and that was must have been because like, just on a side note, Jim, I think sometimes the problem for us Westerners is we are in fact, and I say this with a whole bunch of caveats, of course, but we're in fact too privileged and cushioned. Like, I think sometimes, like just being able to just like sit in my comfy office and speculate on theology and philosophy. Like, what am I even doing? Because the truth is, Jim, and I mean this sincerely. When I hear people like you speak, I'm sort of like, I know I said I'm metaphysically an atheist, but I'm deeply a follower of Christ. Like, I take the message of Christ seriously, and I try to live out, act it out. But then I always feel like an hypocrite, because I'm like, right now, if I was truly a follower of Christ, I would fucking sell all of this shit and serve somewhere, go on in any capacity I have, probably go to Gaza and serve there, because I do believe this ultimate message of Christ, whatever it is something rather traumatic. It's just this completely seeing yourself in the abyss of the other while maintaining that otherness, and at the same time, just like when you spoke about that 10-year-old girl or this boy being punished for not selling enough cigarettes, that pain, it has to be something we all feel. And of course, I can put it in like this very aphoristic way, and it's in a way impossible to feel that pain. But I think the idea is that it's we nonetheless, at least, if it's really interesting, because I think Christianity has all of these paradoxes, and some like Pascal's idea that, if you pretend like you're a Christian, you'll become a Christian. Yeah. I would say you take that idea and you say you pretend like you care about that girl, even if you don't, even if you can't fully empathize with that person's pain, you nonetheless pretend like you do. Because I think at a human level, someone here, unless you're a psychopath, you hear a story like that, you can't not but feel sick in your stomach. But nonetheless, you really don't know what it's like to be a 10-year-old girl working in a brothel. Like, most of us wouldn't know. But I think the Christian idea is you nonetheless serve. You just, it's like, it's not this like, it's both an inner and outer project, but the inner ultimately is manifest in the outer. And that's why, like, for me, these like ideological justifications, sort of like in the book of Job, when when Job is suffering, the three wise guys comes out, it might be this. So I see Jordan Peterson, William Lane Craig, all these people trying to justify Christian suffering, and I think that's why I specifically like this point number 4, because I think that does capture this irreconcilable contradiction imminent to Christianity of an all-loving God, and then a God that allows all of these immense, unspeakable suffering in the world.
Well, I think that I think one of the big mistakes that Christianity made about Jesus was postulating the idea that Jesus was different because he was divine and in essence more divine than any of us, which the way I see it is that Jesus was special because he was courageously more human than most. And I think not because he was divine. And I think that the problem with Christianity is that it's always claimed that Jesus was different because this idea that he was both divine and human. But I would argue that Jesus includes all of humankind, and this distinction he makes about himself, that there is both a transcendent and a grounded aspect to who he was in space and time, and that this very fact is true of each of us. I think that this kind of gets to the idea of, did Jesus sin, or was Jesus a sinner? And I could easily make the argument that, well, what are the reasons why I think Jesus told his disciples, and, hey, I'm not going to be here long, I have to go away, and the disciples were just distraught, like, how can we survive unless Jesus is here? And I think that the point with Jesus was there has to be a transition. If I stay, what you're going to think is this is about me, my personality. You're going to make a religion out of me, when the message is that anything that I am, you are. Like, the only difference between me and you is only in the embodiment of the truth itself. It's not that I have a higher truth for me, or that I'm special and can access it in a way that you can't. And so I think that this idea that Jesus was divine and human, which makes him an untouchable, sort of figure in religion, which is sort of insane, since the big question in Christianity is, what would Jesus do? But you can't really ask, what would Jesus do? If then you're going to say, well, only Jesus could do it because he's the only one who was human and God, and you're just like a measly human being. So how could you possibly do what Jesus did? So I think people like Carl Jung saw Jesus as an archetype for the self, the whole self, the integration of the transcendent side, the shadow. I think that the gospel writers wrote stories about Jesus based on oral traditions. They were probably selective in the stories that they chose to present what they wanted to about Jesus. And so a lot of things never got in the Bible about Jesus, about his, romantic relationships, about the time he got drunk at a wedding, or, other things that happened in his life as a human person. I mean, Jesus was no saint. Jesus spoke truth to power. He turned over tables in the temple. He violated virtually every religious rule of his tradition, and he lambasted religious leaders using almost every profane saying there was to challenge their religious authority. So how we made Jesus into this saint who carries lambs and picks daisies and pats little children on their head and is lily white and tells people to turn the other cheek. Well, I don't even know where we got all of that.
Yeah, I'll just say this. Like, for me, if I could draw a parallel right now to who the figure of Christ is, as I see him in an archetypal sense, it's Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg's a great parallel to what Christ is doing. This kind of person who subverts the symbolic order, just a bit of a troublemaker, but in the best possible way, where trouble has to be made in this world. And I think I just want to say this just for the listener. Like, I mean, we're kind of obviously riffing here, but one thing I do appreciate, Jim, about you is, like, you are a theologian in the sense that, like, when I read your work, you do justify your points with, like, biblical verses. So you don't just, I can see that you work through the texts carefully. And the truth is, most people who have bought into the ideology of Christianity don't even, work through the Bible. They don't even read the Bible, really. It's just this kind of whatever they're told to justify what Christianity is. And I'm not necessarily even saying that you have to have this deep biblical, you need to do like deep biblical exegesis and scholarship and all of that. But I mean, I just want to say for the listener here, like, all the points Jim is making, like, read his blog. You can see that he does, like, Romans or whatever, he just justify with biblical verses, because I think that's important too, because at the end of the day, I mean, I don't want to just reduce Christianity to like a text, but the Bible is Christianity in a way, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's just that. It's a church, it's a community, it's a embodied experience. However, if we are to talk about, let's call it, for lack of a better term, the ethics of Christianity, I would say a good place to go to is the Bible. So right, therefore, well, I just want to make that point here.
Yeah, I think that sometimes people will say my authority's in the Bible, but really what they should say, which would be more accurate, is that my authority is in what my church taught me that the Bible means. So, exactly. And that's including me. I mean, I went to seminary, got theological education, but I really wasn't doing exegesis, which is what you're told you are doing, which is you're pulling the meaning out of the text by using all these tools, the original languages and all this stuff. What you're really doing is eisegesis, which is you're pretty much starting with a systematic theology that you're reading into the text itself. And I think that you're right. It's very difficult to conceive of a Christianity without the Bible. After all, Christians view the Bible as an infallible, inerrant, absolute truth of God to humankind. I mean, that's, it's the same thing with ex-Mormons. It's very difficult for, sometimes ex-Mormons will want to reform Mormonism. They'll leave the LDS or leave the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, and they'll think, well, can I reform this? But the problem with reforming Mormonism is that it's the fundamental pieces that are the problematic pieces. Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the practice of polygamy, like those are foundational pieces that you really would have a hard time rewilding in some new kind of Mormonism. The good news about Christianity, I guess you could say, is that, well, you can build on Jesus as a figure, whether or not you think Jesus was a historical person or just a myth or legend. There is sort of enough there to build on going forward, without the religion of Christianity that's wrapped around it. Whereas in Mormonism, that's harder to do because it's a little hard to come up with a Joseph Smith that you can take forward. Now, to be fair, there are people who do take Joseph Smith forward, and there's debate on whether or not we should blame Brigham Young or Joseph Smith about the problems in the Mormon church. But I'm just saying that I think that one of Christianity's great gifts to the world is the figure Jesus, who seems to persist and endure an interest across many different religious traditions, including people who are atheists. Now, I don't care if a person believes in Jesus. I don't care if they take it forward. Like, people have the right and the autonomy to choose to believe whatever they want. It doesn't have to include Jesus or anything Christian. I just would draw the line if whatever you're taking forward is damaging and hurting other people or the world we live in. Now, I know people will say, well, Jim, you need to define what that means exactly. And I know there'd be differences of opinion about what harming the world means. But just for myself personally, I don't really have an agenda in terms of needing people to believe a certain thing. If people want to be atheists, fine. If people want to believe, in the supernatural, the realm of the supernatural. I mean, even panentheism, there's still a thing called God that intersects with the world. There's like a God that's in the world or beyond the world. Is panentheism probably a step in a better direction than theism? But probably, because it does seem to not have some of that same baggage. At the core, it's still a big problem in panentheism because it still conceives of a separate thing called God, no matter how you slice it. So as long as there's a separate thing we're calling God that's doing something that we can or providing something that we don't have, then I do see a bit of a problem in that.
Yeah, it's funny when you mentioned panentheism or pantheism, it reminded me of because you American, he's the Vivek Ramaswamy, who ran for the Republican presidency.
Right,
I think now he's running for like a governor somewhere. And then all of these the Christian nationalist types kind of questioned him. You're a Hindu. How can you be a leader of a Christian nation? Like, it's like the one true God is Jesus Christ, and Christianity is the ultimate truth. How dare you, run for office in the U.S., a Christian country? And then it's just so sad. I mean, I'm like, look, I in a way, I feel no sympathy because you signed up for this, bro. But it's like he's like trying to justify. It's like, oh, I'm a monotheistic Hindu. He's trying to really squeeze in some kind of. It's pathetic, but it's kind of hilarious. The kind of these mental games people play to justify ideology.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that E.O. Wilson, he wrote The Meaning of Human Existence or something like that. But another book he wrote was Consilience. And the concept of consilience, as you know, is that one way to verify if something's real and true is that there will be a witness to its truth across multiple disciplines and, ways of looking at it. Edward Wilson. The Meaning of Human Existence. He also wrote a book called Consilience. But I think we sort of could make a little bit of an argument that there is a consilience that both Western science, Eastern spirituality, Christian mysticism, even Western philosophy like Spinoza's sort of philosophical monism, they all seem to be in agreement that there's really fundamentally only one thing that exists, and everything else is either a modality of that or expression of that or happening in it or part of it or whatever, but Spinoza sort of confused the matter because he insisted on using the actual word God to refer to his monism. And
like a deistic sense. Yeah.
Well, he wasn't a theist, right? Yeah, like in a deep sort of, some people say he was claiming as an atheist, some people claim him as a panentheist, but there's about 46,000 words that have been dismissed from the human language and are obsolete, and I'm a proponent of including the word God in the list of words that are obsolete, because just like we say you can't unsee something, right? You see some traumatic accident, you can't unsee it. Okay, well, in the same way, you can't un-God of religion. I don't think you can. There's too much baggage in the term. There's like the word itself cannot be scrubbed of its religious, you know, thinking. It's not possible. And I guess that I would, show me one example where that's not true. Like panentheism, you're still got this thing separate God. Pantheism, everything is God, nature is God, God is nature of the universe. Well, what is this thing you're calling God? I mean, like it's now I understand there's not a lot of better other words, source, energy, ground of being. I mean, we can come up with a lot of other words and not use the word God. But I just think that God, you're symbolizes the master signifier, the big other, which to me basically encompasses everything that's absolutely unhelpful about religion where it's present, these ideas.
I promise this will be the only interruption. In the past few years, I truly have cherished connecting with all you listeners of this podcast, whether through email, video calls, or simply the comments. And I'd hate to lose this fledgling community we've built around our shared love for philosophy and science, and so I'm kindly asking you to consider subscribing to this podcast on Substack. Let's cut the BS. In our techno-feudalist times, no platform is perfect, and at the end of the day, these companies own us. However, if I may naively be hopeful, Substack at least allows me to export email addresses for me to keep connected with you all if one of these platforms decides to kick me off for some reason, which, as we're well aware, they've done in the past with no explanation. In fact, this almost happened to me recently. So please, let's stay connected through Substack, and if all else fails, at least the good old SMT protocol. That is a nerdy joke for you programmers out there.
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from. I don't know, I think I'm sort of ambivalent to that because I've heard you say this before in your other public talks too. Because the thing is, yeah, here's where we live in terms of profound contradictions. It's this notion that, like, okay, we thought, with the new atheist movement, we thought, oh, we're gonna rid ourselves of these anachronistic nonsense, God, religious talk. And then it was replaced by something even worse, which was this weird Silicon Valley tech broism, this, AGI neoliberal kind of spirituality.
Yeah.
And then now Christian nationalism. So it's like, in a way, man, I would probably prefer like maybe for lack of a better term, bourgeois Christianity, just people who go to church on Sundays and don't, worry too much about these esoteric ideas. I don't know. I'm of the belief that whatever the word, the signifier God is, I'm of the belief that the religious attitude would never go away. In a way, for me, it's as human as language, or as human as sex and war. It's just a perennial kind of mode of being.
I was a bit critical of Dawkins not too long ago for his newfound love for cultural Christianity. Now that's a little unfair but what I heard Dawkins saying is, okay, on the menu of ideologies, I would choose Judeo-Christianity because it's the best buttress against other ideologies. It would be quite destructive to Western civilization. So I don't know if you remember, he got in this big debate with I can't remember the woman who was she was a Muslim and then she turned atheist and now she's Christian.
Iron Hersey Ali.
Yes. Okay. And that's kind of the and so this cultural Christianity, which is that it's useful to maintain Western civilization. And after all, we do found some joy in it, the holidays and traditions and so on, which I understand. And, but it was a little, I don't know, like there was some slight disappointment that, okay, so we must have God in some way, even as a minimum culturally, in order to keep the project of Western civilization going. So maybe after all, atheism isn't all that great of an idea because it's not capable of doing this. And I guess I just was wondering why there wouldn't be the view of, let's articulate how a non-religious lack of the absence of belief in God is a real opening towards something that's deeply meaningful that could in fact move Western civilization forward in ways that religion will never allow it to. And you could argue that Christian nationalism is just sort of one of the symptoms. Once you go the route of prefacing Christianity as a religion, then you're going to wind up with somebody, like turning that into Christian nationalism. And so, I don't know. I don't want to be dismissive of how the world religions, in particularly their more progressive expressions, have absolutely made profoundly significant differences, in the journey of our species and in human beings, but I think that religion has really succeeded at creating an infrastructure to propagate its views, to educate children into them, and so on. And secular or non-religious spirituality will probably never be able to match that aspect of religion. It doesn't lend itself to this sort of centralized infrastructure building sort of path. Sure, there's the American Atheist Association, there's American Humanist Association, there's even atheist churches and so on, but I just don't think anytime soon, like, we're going to somehow find the infrastructure for a large scale way of teaching people humanistic values, which in my mind would include a respect for all religious traditions, not stamping them out, but creating a space where they could coexist peacefully.
Yeah, it's very much an open question, because I think, for example, here's where I really admire Peter Rawlins's work with he's trying to start a liturgy for his kind of theology, power theology, this notion of the church of contradictions. And in fact, if I'm planning in 2027, 28 to be in Belfast, and if he's got the Wake Festival, then I would definitely be attending because I'd love to. And it's the liturgy part's really important. This notion of like artistically through music, art, all of that, you articulate that in the flesh, so to speak. This kind of these rather abstract ideas that he's dealing with. And the second thing I would say is, you made a comment, Jim, here, and I think this will be a good segue to the other point number 6, 8, and 9, which I'll read out in your note. But yeah, we probably need Christianity to sort of save or sustain Western civilization. Now, again, I'm going to be provocative here. I would just say this: I am a Western chauvinist, but in this way. Not the kind of Western civilization, that all of these Groyper type weird Groypers and, what's Christian nationalist types defend about like Christianity and family and all that. But rather, really, I would say here the European Enlightenment, or specifically the German Enlightenment, more than even the Scottish Enlightenment. This notion of this Cartesian skepticism, this constant doubting, this kind of the critical lens you put onto the world, where you're constantly questioning things. And then, of course, scientific method. It really, here, I think of course, we have the Islamic Enlightenment. We have many movements in the history of mathematics and science. But then what we call modern science, at least, really is a product of Europe. I mean, we have to kind of, I think I have to say that. I mean, and those are the things I defend. But the thing is, when you think of like right now, the Western civilization defenders, they're completely opposed to, I mean, Candace Owens is talking about demon possession and like demons being, I don't know, all these like rather bizarre things. And then, the Christian nationalists are talking about like, Trump being sent by God, and like he's a spiritual agent of God. So it's like this has nothing to do with whatever you think really the gold or the value of Western civilization is. And so just from that, I think this is a good segue, Jim, to your other points, which again, this is really deeply related. So point number 6, you say Christian theism undermines the shared scientific, philosophical and spiritual understanding that existence, the universe, and ultimate reality are one thing in which everything grounds its being. And then point number 8, you say Christian theism asserts its authority is based upon a literalist interpretation of an ancient writing that predates modern science. And then in 9, you say Christian theism's. This is an interesting one because I just want to make a small comment on 9 before I give the stage back to you. Christian theism's theological edifice is built with fantastical doctrines that can't be verified or reasonably believed, such as the fall and original sin, virgin birth of Jesus, Trinitarian view of God, and eternal conscious torment. So this is really interesting because I do think, in a way, one reason I like kind of Kierkegaard's reading of Christianity is that if you truly want to be a Christian, point number 9 is the reason to be a Christian, because it's an utterly bizarre, either you're a complete lunatic or there's something here. And that's why Kierkegaard, especially in the philosophical manuscripts, I think he says you shouldn't, it's a huge mistake to make Christianity contingent on some kind of operationalizable or empirically verifiable, like scientific, cosmology, or some kind of a priori argument, because those things are purely contingent. And if that's the base of your Christianity, then your Christianity, you aren't even truly a Christian. But yeah, sorry, there was a lot there. But I'm curious if you could just kind of comment on those 3 points in the note.
Yeah, well, I do think that it is difficult to create a litmus test to authenticate who is or isn't a Christian. Because like we already said, that, there is some revisionist history here, or church history, where, that old, the winners write the history, right? So that even early on in Christianity, there were people who questioned the divinity of Jesus, things like the Trinity or the virgin birth and so on. But those voices were silenced, and they didn't really have a significant part in shaping what Christianity became. There's Project 2025, but before that, there was Project 325, which is the way that Constantine conveniently became converted and then found a way to use Christianity as sort of the glue to stabilize his empire and his reign. And so this is not a new sort of trick to pull to use religion as a way of achieving, political or nationalistic aims and so on. So I think that the idea of, when you start deconstructing, when you look at Christian theology, to some extent, it's kind of like the a really bad, well, there's layers of problems in Christian theology. Each time there's an attempt to solve the previous problem. So, if we're going to say that Jesus is the Son of God and he's human, well, that's a problem, because we already said everybody who's born a human inherits the sin condition. So somehow we've got to get Jesus into the world without the sin condition. The only way you do that is that somehow you got to make it to where Jesus has a virgin birth, where God is actually responsible for, the impregnation of Mary, and bypasses natural conception so that there wouldn't be a sin condition. And then, but that creates a problem because what about Mary? Mary had to cooperate in some ways. So wouldn't Mary, her participation with the whole Spirit of God or whatever, be a reason to contaminate Jesus? And that's why, the Catholics have the additional doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, where, Mary is also kind of made sinless in order to be the proper mother with God to produce, the divine and perfect Jesus. And so, I think that that would be an example of the fantastical steps that theology has to make to cover its tracks and somehow postulate something that could be quasi-rational to present its core points. The atonement is another example. Like, I don't know, how a person, even how Jesus' blood on the cross can somehow be sort of metaphysically infused into the human race in order to erase the sin condition problem. Like, it doesn't really make sense that the righteousness of Jesus could be imputed into the human person based on his blood sacrifice. Like, that's akin to saying that I, can tune into a radio station by turning the knobs on my microwave. A microwave can't tune in a radio station because they're two completely different. So how the physical bloodshed of Jesus on the cross ends up being what solves and cures the sin condition, doesn't seem to be like it's beyond reason. I don't think a rationally thinking person, I think. So that doesn't mean that there aren't other. That doesn't mean that the virgin birth, the fall of man, the atonement doesn't have mythic significance to the human person. But I think the problem is that when religion insists that these be taken literally and building their a sort of metaphysical, theological system based on a literal interpretation of the Bible, I think that is, highly problematic.
Yeah, I mean, you probably remember this viral clip where Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, he was interviewing Jordan Peterson, and he asked, so do you believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ? Now, if you ask from me, I'd say, of course not. Like, empirically, no way a dead guy, came walking out of that grave. But I do think there's mythological significance. But then Alex, because Peterson, he never answers a question. Alex kept pushing him. And then he was like, if you take a Panasonic camera and like record on the little LCD screen, would you see it? And then Peterson said, yeah. So my whole thing is like, I mean, what's all of these woo-woo Jungian archetypal? Just you believe that a dead guy, came back to life and walked out of that grave. Like, why not just say it like that? And in a way, here's where I probably do. As much as I'm critical of kind of the people who believe in the supernatural, the stuff, the fantastical stuff, I'm like, at least they say what they believe, like this. You gotta at least give them that credit, give them due there.
Yeah, you mean like you're saying that, Jordan Peterson is often, a bit ambiguous, right? When you really press him on some things about this sort of thing. And I think that I think it's unfortunate that some forms of Christianity absolutely require the bodily resurrection of Jesus to sort of solidify and validate the whole system, because I don't think that it's necessary that there was a bodily resurrection of Jesus. And I think there's endless ways that Jesus, I think, is quite significant to, our species that don't require him to be God in the flesh or to have been, bodily raised from the dead. But it's necessary to do that with Jesus because, again, you've got like these issues that have to be solved all the way down the line. And it's kind of like the Jenga blocks, like you can't pull out one of these. If you pull out one of these theological blocks, the whole thing comes crashing down. So, there has to be the divinity of Jesus. There has to be the virgin birth. There has to be, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. There has to be the Bible's the absolute inerrant, word of God to humankind. Because there are all these Jenga blocks that if you just pull one of them, and that's why a lot of times religious deconstruction for a lot of people goes pretty quickly, because once you pull one of them out, then it's like, oh my God, none of this suddenly makes sense. It just all sort of starts to collapse, once you start kind of tugging at the theological strings of classic Christian theism.
So is that something you experience in your work as you assist or help people with this process?
Yeah, in fact, non-religious spiritual direction is often working with people who have left religion, and they're in the process of what we tend to call religious deconstruction and post-religion reconstruction. And, like we talked about, leaving religion can be catastrophic because your identity, your existential certainty, your social network, your community, all sorts of things are attached to your religion. So when you leave, and there's no substitute for it, or, once you lose all of that, then it can be quite a grim place. So that's why, I use the phrase deconstruct to reconstruct. You have to do both. If you just deconstruct, and I'm the kind of person that just keeps deconstructing. I'll deconstruct my theology. I'll deconstruct God. I'll deconstruct the universe and life, my existence. I'll deconstruct everything down to the studs of human existence. And that can wind up in a dark nihilism if you're not also reconstructing. Like we talked about with existential philosophy, it's one thing to say, well, there's no meaning to life and it's over. And then you don't go any further than that. And so it's despairing until you realize, oh, I'm the meaning maker. So the question isn't what is the meaning of life? The question is, what does it mean for me to live life meaningfully? And that actually is a question that I can answer because I can determine what matters to me, what my values are, the kind of person I want to be in the world, and so on. So this is the kind of work that's done in the deconstruction and reconstruction, particularly high control religion. It's very intersectional. If you were a woman, you were damaged by religious patriarchy in a way that men weren't. If you're a member of the LGBTQI community, you were damaged in a way that a straight person wouldn't have been in their religious involvement. And so it's kind of it's different depending on, a lot of different factors that
a deep trauma.
Right. Audre Lorde, who was a champion of the whole idea of intersectionality. It needs to be applied in religious deconstruction and reconstruction. That suffering is different or compounded based on, all these different kinds of factors. And and along those lines, I've been really, it's impacted my journey greatly to discover philosophical thinking of the global South, let's say. If you go and you Google the top philosophers of all time, they're all going to be white, middle-aged, Eurocentric. Most of them are going to be, sure, there's a few women that'll be in there, one or two, but basically it's very Western and Eurocentric. And, meanwhile, they've done philosophy in Africa. They've done philosophy in Latin America. They've done philosophy in these parts, that is really brilliant work in philosophy. But it just, the hermeneutical injustice, epistemological injustice occurs where, people do not have access to, these other aspects of knowledge or philosophy. And I think that it's like it's really unfortunate. But I think we're moving in that direction. I think there's a lot of discussion about this post-ideological, post-disciplinary, unsystematic sort of way of approaching knowledge. This third space of, that the idea of, some of the most consequential thinking is on the margins and sort of in between spaces. And I think that's a very, very hopeful, phenomenon that I see occurring more and more. And that's why
I concur. I mean,
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I concur. I mean, I would say, for a fact, I can see this. Probably you could even measure this empirically. In the sciences, there's a lot of interdisciplinary work. I mean, with all of these paradoxes with quantum theory. And then, in fact, in the past 40 or 50 years, I think, in the natural sciences, most of the progress were made in biology. And now a lot, for example, the free energy principle, which it pulls from statistical physics and all of that, but now it's being applied to a theory of everything, to the realm, the domain of physics too. But it started off in cognitive neuroscience and theoretical biology. So I think we certainly live in interesting times. Again, so it's really interesting. This ambiguity of existence, the way Merleau-Ponty put it, that itself is creating, and this is why I'm constantly, I think we should be open to where this goes, because it's like it manifests in the worst forms in fascism, but also in the best possible forms, which is like people are moving towards, acknowledging historical epistemic injustice to kind of the interdisciplinary work and all of that. That fellow agrees.
Yeah, can I close this door? Let me close this door.
Yeah, that's fine. And also, sure, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Speaking of atheist society, or not society, but thinking, the future of religion, let's see, by, what is his name? Darn, The Future of Religion, Roberto Unger.
Oh, yes.
Nobody ever is going to hear about that book. Like, I've been in deconstruction and all this, conversation for all these years. Not once has The Future of Religion come up, which is arguably one of the most substantial offerings of repurposing religion without any belief in God or the supernatural. Roberto Unger, and nobody's even heard of it.
Brilliant.
But it's a fascinating, and so this, the story goes that there's so much to gain and learn from, voices, all over the world. And, I just did the last, no one's probably ever heard of. I just, did in my Recon U thing I'm doing through my Substack. Walter Mignolo. No one's ever heard of Walter Mignolo. Meanwhile, he's an Argentine. He's one of the most well-respected, post-colonial theorists that the world has ever known. And nobody's ever heard of the guy. Look, if you're Argentine, you're screwed pretty much. I mean, no one's going to hardly hear anything, and especially if you're from, so anyway, I don't even know how I got into this other than I think that here's how this relates. People who leave religion, I said we do a lot of religious deconstruction work. People who leave religion leave with what I call human development deficits, delayed emotional development, lack of critical thinking skills, and an inadequate base of knowledge would be a few. Another would be a poor relationship with yourself, a lack of agency, this sort of thing because you got the shame-based message. But this lack of adequate knowledge, inadequate human development knowledge, there's not a base of knowledge that's necessary for proper human development, whether it's in psychology, whether, there's all kinds of fields that are absent for most people that are in high control religion, because you're basically taught, well, what else do you need but the Bible and just maybe some commentaries or Christian books? After all, this is God's word. So why would you need anything else, But even beyond that, there could be human development deficits because of epistemological injustice or hermeneutical injustice. We've never been exposed to the rich variety of knowledge that there is to cultivate stronger existential health.
Yeah, I mean, point number 10 in that note, you say here, Christian theism propagates a transactional relationship with God in which obedience, prayer, and devotion are expected to yield divine rewards and avoid divine punishment. So that the reason I read that out was because I'm thinking, like, if someone converts out of Christianity and like this, obedience, prayer, and devotion, and if one becomes an atheist or starts being skeptical about the existence of God, so much of Christianity is this idea that in a way, I'll pray, I'll be obedient to God, I'll submit, and then I'll have some sort of salvation, or I'll have a better life in the afterlife. And it can be deeply and unequivocally deeply traumatic for someone to sort of recreate themselves and, as you say, reconstruct from a shattered symbolic order. I mean, in psychoanalysis, they call this subjective restitution, which people go through, where all of your symbolic order is destroyed. And I can just say this. I believe this adamantly. This is not something one can do alone. Like, this is not like this some inner in the kind of the new age woo way where you can't do this through, in my view, through like 10 hours a day of like mindfulness meditation. I mean, I meditate. Meditation is good for you, but at least that's what I think so, or I tell myself that. But it's like, yeah, you use that term. Can you repeat that term you use? Is it the lacking in development, or there was a specific term you used?
Human development deficits.
Human development deficits.
And it's
yeah.
It's the most important work in religious deconstruction. People who, a very shallow way of thinking about religious deconstruction is you make it a belief system swap out with all the old beliefs that don't make sense anymore and replace it with a new belief. But exactly. But there's deeper work, that really needs to be done to address these human development deficits. And you make a good point, which is that a lot of people, when they leave religion, high control religion particularly, they're just like kind of done. They've been traumatized. They feel like they've given so many years of their life to something that now they see isn't even true. So they're kind of like, okay, I'm done with all that theology. I'm done with going to church. I'm done with those people. I'm done with all those legalistic rituals, like goodbye. And, I'm moving on from that. And I'm now liberated. Now, the downside to that is that, look, Homo sapiens created rituals for a reason. I mean, Adam Grant, just wrote, I think it was Adam Grant that wrote Atomic Habits, just making the point that, I mean, there's certain things that human beings have relied on historically to stabilize them in a high functioning capacity, to stabilize them in a coherent, way of making sense of the world. And so, you can rewild rituals and structure, and but the person in deconstruction who doesn't know that yet, who doesn't see that yet, can deeply struggle. And that's often where nihilism, existential crisis, and this kind of thing happens, because you can't just, it's like they would say about people who smoke, right? Like, you know, like, okay, you're going to stop smoking. And the idea is you chew gum to substitute for it because you kind of need something. And it's the same thing with leaving religion.
Or you do something worse, you start CrossFit.
Oh, God. Yeah, right. Yeah, you become addicted to fitness or who knows what. And I'm an ultra runner, at least my past is in ultra endurance sports. But
I see the ring, yeah.
And so you know, I sometimes wonder if it's some form of self-harm. The jury's out. But,
oh, same. I mean, yeah, I think we all need a bit of that, right, for sure.
So yeah.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Yeah. So that I'm trying to think of what that number 10 was saying on that list.
Well, I think number 10 was, you were really talking about this kind of relational, transactional aspect of religion. But what really caught my eye was you were touching on this idea that the transaction, it's Christianity is complicated, the history of this, there's Calvinism and all that, but it's like, it does come with this idea that I'll devote, I'll submit, I'll partake in the rituals, and then there's something at the end of the tunnel, or something, a gift I get in return, right?
Right. Well,
and then suddenly when you realize that there's no transaction, you get nothing out of it, then what?
Right. And I think the interesting about this is the idea that we have a transactional relationship with God, and obedience and devotion kind of curries favor from God, and prayer curries favor from God. Well, if that was true, there's two people associated with the Christian tradition, which are arguably the most central figures related to Christianity. The first is Jesus, and the second is Paul, who by most accounts is attributed to writing the bulk of the New Testament. You could argue that Christianity is really Paul and not Jesus. But the point here is, if that performance transactional mindset worked, the two people that it would have naturally worked for would have been Jesus and Paul, right? Like Jesus, if it really worked that the good person doing the will of God and devoted and praying and doing all that gets a better life or God's blessing and favor, well, look, Jesus was betrayed. Jesus lost all his friends. He suffered. He was beaten. You can't find anywhere in the Jesus of life where he's sort of getting the benefits of having favor with God in his circumstances. The Apostle Paul, had those stories about he was beaten and shipwrecked and fed to lions and all this stuff, that it just breaks down. There's no way that there's any kind of evidence that this idea of a transactional relationship with God is real. The thing is that there's only two places in the Bible that explicitly defines God. One says that God is spirit, another says that God is love. So let's take the one, God is love. If you say God is love, you can also turn around and say that love is God. Well, what you're saying is, the verse doesn't say God does loving things. It says that God literally is love. Whatever love is what God is. So there'd never be a moment, if that were true, that any person would ever be outside of God's love, because it's not something that God does. It's something that God is. So I once was talking to an atheist, and the question came up, do you believe in God? He said, no. And then, so I said, do you believe in love? And his answer was, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, I believe in love. Everybody knows that love is good. Everybody realizes that love, giving it, receiving it. Everyone knows that love is the sort of the highest, supreme, expression of the best of being human. It's virtually the true fulfillment of all religion. We all know instinctually it's right and good and so on. Okay. So you believe in love, but you don't believe in God. But what if I told you that God is love? If I told you that God is love, would you believe in God then? And you would have to say yes, because you just told me that you believed in love. So if that's all God is love, well, and then you turn around and you say love is God, which means that the highest truth and the highest reality, the peak experience accessible to the Homo sapien is the experience of something that we use the word love to describe. But that obliterates the idea that God is some separate big other in the sky. And if we pray and we're devoted and read the Bible, we're good Christians, that God is going to give us favor. And if we don't, then we're going to be disciplined by God and God's going to disapprove. And ultimately, we could end up in eternal conscious torment in hell. Like, that whole narrative is not only deeply damaging, but you can't even find evidence for it in the Bible itself if you really look into it deeply.
Correct. Jim, I think we've gone way over time. I apologize. And this is a good denouement. Ending with love. I mean, what better way to end this? But I think also, I just want to say on that last little bit you said there, evidence in the Bible. And this is why, again, I appreciate your work, because, yeah, right now we're just riffing. But read Jim's writing. And that's important, because I do think I do believe in intellectual labor. Like, if you are going to do theology, you know, yes, you can write, you can philosophize, but also visit the texts, look at the texts, study them exegetically, hermeneutically, whatever way you can. And I think you do that, Jim. This is wonderful. I mean, I just also want to say, I really don't see myself as doing some kind of religious project, even though I certainly am a follower of Christ and interested in this stuff. But I put it this way, sort of like Thomas Huxley, I'm like Darwin's bulldog. So, people like yourself, process theologians, and then more philosophically, Cadell's work. So, and then, of course, the person who really, for me, is Peter Rollins and the Pirate Theology. Even though I'm not really trying to advocate for that kind of message or whatever, right. I see myself as like a bulldog. I'm trying to see, like, look, there are other ways to, in my case, view Christianity, to have a relationship with Christ, other than what's told to us by our current ideological apparatus. So, yeah, Jim, I mean, this has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for humoring me with some of my, segues all over the place. It's more fun like that. And, yeah, I mean, so what kind of, apart from obviously the kind of the counseling work you do, what other projects have you got going right now?
Well, in 2020, I founded the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality, and that is an effort that particularly works with people in religious deconstruction and post-religion reconstruction. It's also a community for people that are looking to find belonging and a sense of connection with people that, they won't be judged, or kind of, open-minded people who can accept others where they're at. And in the context of that, I do train non-religious spiritual directors and existential health practitioners that particularly work with people around these things we talked about: nihilism, the collapse of a belief system, reconstructing the spirituality, whether or not you believe in God or the supernatural or not. And, like you said, I've published some books, but most of my writing I do now on Substack. It's kind of where I do, publish my latest thinking on all these topics: existential health, nihilism, religion, this sort of thing, and so all of that keeps me pretty busy.
Wonderful. But yeah, I'll leave a link to all of those in the show notes, and yeah, including, I did kind of just read the landing page for the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality, which is a great, yeah, you're a very good marketer. It's a great term.